Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted many areas for improvement in our society, and it has also afforded us the opportunity to reflect and to realize the importance of transparency, oversight, and public participation in government processes and policymaking decisions. This is particularly true in an environment which prioritizes the efficiency in delivering relief to citizens, oftentimes at the expense of due diligence. After Minister Clark tabled a bill in Parliament on Tuesday to establish an independent fiscal commission, a few persons joined the discussion on Twitter and chimed in on it being a step towards improving oversight and accountability of both the fiscal policy papers and also the budget outturns. Today, we are here to widen this knowledge amongst the citizens as we promote public access to budget information and the adoption of inclusive and accountable budget systems. I am Natasha Burnett, Communications Officer at CAPRI, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our webinar for the launch of the report on Jamaica's performance in the Open Budget Survey, with a focus on the areas of transparency and oversight in the government budget process. The survey that informed this report was carried out in collaboration with the International Budget Partnership. We are very grateful to the IBP for their support. We believe that the findings and recommendations will increase your knowledge and enable informed discussions. To lead the discussion, we have brought together a distinguished panel of experts to share with us their insights. Ms. Darlene Morrison, Financial Secretary at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, Jamaica. Ms. Jeanette Calder, Executive Director of the Jamaica Accountability Meter Portal. Ms. Claire Schouten, Senior Program Officer, International Advocacy at the International Budget Partnership. Ms. Monique Graham, Researcher at CAPRI, and Ms. Loris Jarrett, Deputy Financial Secretary for the Public Expenditure Division at the Ministry of Finance, will also be joining the conversation. The discussion will entail the presentation of the survey findings by our Executive Director, Dr. Damien King, and a brief opening remarks by our panelists, followed by a question and answer segment to be moderated by Dr. King. To participate in this discussion, we invite you to scan the QR code on screen or go to slido.com and enter the event code CAPRI to share your questions. Comments can also be shared in the live chat on YouTube and also on Twitter. We at CAPRI are delighted to have you with us this morning as we remain committed to the production and dissemination of evidence-based research to inform public policy decision-making. Do enjoy the conversation. Dr. King will now present the report findings.
Following money. A better way to put this is, can you follow the money? It has been a long time since citizens appreciated the importance of openness and transparency in fiscal matters. Patrick Henry wrote, "The liberties of a people never were, nor ever will be secure, when the transactions of their rulers may be concealed from them." It has taken us nearly 200 years from that insight to perform the first objective, systematic look at the degree to which there is openness and transparency in Jamaica's fiscal matters. And this is of the utmost importance. Democracy depends on the ability of a people to know what their government is doing, to know what their government is doing with their money. The methodology we're going to use for this assessment, which derives from a methodology that the International Budget Partnership has devised, uses a scorecard. The scorecard assesses three components: transparency, public participation, and oversight. And these are applied to the three phases of the budget cycle: formulation, before the fiscal year begins, implementation, and review. Jamaica, to sort of skip to the punchline, has done rather well in scoring most of these components. We are going to go through each of the components to identify what are the ways in which Jamaica's government can further improve on its openness and transparency. So starting with the transparency component, we're going to be looking at the following in assessing transparency: the free availability of information, whether the information available on expenditure satisfies three kinds of information that we need. First, citizens need to know who is spending the money. That is to say, which agency of government. This is called the administrative classification. So we want to know, for example, that this expenditure is being undertaken by the Ministry of Finance, a particular expenditure. We also need to know why the expenditure is being made. What is the purpose? So perhaps the Ministry of Finance is paying for the training of nurses. This is the functional classification. Finally, we need to know what it is actually being spent on. So to continue the example, the Ministry of Finance is paying the salaries of the trainers. This is called the economic classification. So in addition to looking for information on all of these classifications, who is spending it, why it is being spent, for what, and on what it is being spent, we look at 8 key documents in examining this. The first document that's important is some kind of pre-budget statement that indicates government's intentions that it is bringing to formulating the budget. The closest thing that exists in Jamaica's fiscal management is called the budget circular. But there is no publicly available document that indicates to the citizens what government is going to be coming with. So when we look at all of the kinds of information that we would need, this document is not publicly available at all. So one way that the Jamaican government can improve is by making some kind of pre-budget statement available for people to scrutinize ahead of bringing forward the actual budget proposal. The scores that we are using to assess Jamaica's government openness in fiscal matters is a scale of 0 to 100. The second document is the actual budget proposal, which we refer to here simply as the budget. It's a fairly detailed document and gives you the administrative classification, who is spending it, at a deep level of disaggregation. But it doesn't give you a functional classification. It doesn't tell you what the money is being spent for. Again, the ministry has this information internally. It needs to share it publicly. It would also help if the budget were put explicitly in the context of the economic forecasts, the macroeconomic forecasts that the government is basing the budget on. It could also help if the public were given more detailed debt information on what is the path of debt through the fiscal year. The third key document is the actual budget. In Jamaica, that's the Appropriations Act. Would benefit from more detailed information in terms of revenue expectations at a disaggregated level. The Appropriations Act also excludes the functional classification that we think is important. The fourth key document is a citizen's budget. The purpose of the citizen's budget is to translate the budget information into a form and a manner and terminology that can be understood by ordinary citizens, those that don't have the time to engage it at a deep level and don't have any kind of technical experience or training. Jamaica has now started publishing a citizen's budget, which was a an excellent move. This citizens' budget is so important that we would like to see the government make a greater effort to disseminate it in more ways. In addition to just publishing it and making it available, they could take advantage of social media channels, for example, and to attach more like a marketing campaign to it, to make sure it reaches all of those to whom, who are its targets. The next document that's important in fiscal openness is a review of expenditure and revenues throughout the year. The Jamaican government publishes an operations table on a monthly basis. So Jamaicans benefit from timely information in the execution of the budget. It would be helpful if it had greater disaggregation. There is also a need for a mid-year review. This is contained in the Fiscal Policy Paper Interim Report. The Fiscal Policy Paper Interim Report, again, needs to show some of the other classifications, particularly the functional one, and to show progress at a deeper level of disaggregation. An end-of-year report is critical. That is also contained in Jamaica's Fiscal Policy Paper Interim Report. And so the same advantages and issues apply in terms of the year-end report. Finally, a different kind of documentation, a different kind of openness is an audit of what has taken place during the fiscal year. The Auditor General's Department produces a year-end accounts audit and compliance assessment. The AGD's audits are impressively comprehensive. It would be more helpful if more public enterprises could be on its annual list to audit, and if there was some kind of systematic follow-up to see that recommendations made by the AGD in previous years have been enacted. All of this taken together means that Jamaica scores moderately well when we talk about transparency in fiscal matters. Indeed, Jamaica's score puts it right near the median in terms of the global average. This is fairly impressive for a small country, and small countries necessarily have less public bureaucratic capacity. But it still remains far below the benchmarks for which we aim. And the benchmark would be what the OECD countries, that's a group of mostly rich countries with tremendous public administrative capacity. And so that's what we're aiming for. So Jamaica has a ways to go in that regard in terms of transparency. The second component of openness is public participation. And this is where Jamaica really falls down. It turns out that in the formulation of the budget, there's no capacity, there's no channel for the citizens to have any input. This is done, within the cabinet and within the Ministry of Finance. And citizens see it for the first time when it is presented by the Minister of Finance. When it is presented, there's a debate in Parliament that the public then gets line of sight of by attending the public gallery at Gordon House, the seat of Parliament, or by watching the proceedings on TV because they are televised and it's broadcast on the internet as well. So even though there is no input in formulation, they at least get to have sight of it when we get to the stage of it being presented. During the implementation stage, again, the public can attend Parliament and see and hear the debates about expenditure as it unfolds. But again, there's no opportunity for the public itself to ask questions and raise issues. At the end of the year, the Accountant General's Department holds focus groups, and citizens can write in to the Accountant General and provide information and give tips. So for both of these, that provides really the only channel and the only point at which the public gets to have an input. Which means that Jamaica doesn't really score that well on public participation. And in terms of international comparisons, it shows up equally poorly. We are well below the global average in terms of channels for public participation, and even further below the benchmark countries that we aim to be able to match. The final component is oversight, and the two institutions of oversight are the Parliament and the Accountant General's Department. Parliament debates the budget. When the budget is presented at the beginning of the fiscal year, there's a debate between the government and the opposition on the items that are presented. But there's no specialized committee and no capacity, no research and analytical capacity within the Parliament to examine the budget. Once the fiscal year begins and the budget is being implemented, there is a public administration and appropriations committee that meets occasionally to look at fiscal issues. It would be an improvement if this committee were to meet on a more regular basis than it does. At least 3 times per year is kind of a benchmark. At the end of the year, there is no systematic review of the fiscal year that has been completed. So Jamaica does moderately well in this regard. The Accountant General's Department, the other institution of oversight, has no role in the formulation of the budget, nor should it. But in terms of the implementation and review phases, the Accountant General's Department is in an advantageous position by being truly independent of the government and having the freedom to call what it sees. It has the proper legal authorization and is resourced sufficiently to do what it currently does. And it does review the government's fiscal policy paper. So it scores fairly well in that regard. A third institution which would critically help the oversight of fiscal matters would be to establish a fiscal council. The fiscal council would be an independent body whose job it is to examine fiscal matters and which would report directly to the Parliament, giving Parliament the research capacity, the technical capacity to perform its oversight function better. So looking in a broad way at the government's performance, we conclude that Jamaica does reasonably well on fiscal openness, but we see that there are many areas where improvements can be made. Coming out of that, we make the following recommendations. First, that government should publish some kind of pre-budget statement to indicate what its intentions are going to be and what it is looking to implement, to give some period where the public can provide feedback. The budget itself should be presented earlier, before the beginning of the fiscal year, again to provide greater opportunity for people to make commentary on it. The budget proposal needs to have more information. Critically, it should have at least a functional classification. The fiscal policy paper interim report, or whatever is going to satisfy looking at the budget as it is implemented, also needs to have more disaggregated information and different classifications. The biggest improvement can be made by establishing channels for public participation at every phase of the budget process. Parliament's examination of the fiscal execution, whether through the PAAC or otherwise, should be more frequent. And to put in place some kind of established point where Parliament examines the Auditor General's report on fiscal matters and on public bodies. Finally, we make a recommendation which we have left on the list, even though 2 days ago, the Minister of Finance appeared in Parliament to announce exactly the establishment of the Fiscal Council, that a bill will be brought to Parliament to set up an independent fiscal commission. This continues what we see as the government's continued attempt to move towards more openness. We pointed out that they have recently started publishing a citizens budget. About a month ago, they launched an investment map where the public can go online and look at all the investment projects that are underway by the government. And now they have stated an intention to bring a bill to Parliament to establish a fiscal council. So Jamaica is making progress in moving towards even more fiscal openness, even though they are starting from what we think is a relatively decent position in relation to its global comparators. This is where we think that the Jamaican government needs to go in terms of moving further in this direction. I'm anxious to hear what our panelists have to contribute to this discussion and this important area. We welcome Ms. Darlene Morrison, the Financial Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, Ms. Jeanette Calder, the Executive Director of the Jamaica Accountability Meter Portal, Ms. Claire Schouten, Senior Program Officer at the International Budget Partnership, and Ms. Monique Graham, who is the researcher at CAPRI, who now has responsibility for this area of fiscal openness. And we're going to begin by asking all of our panelists to just give a quick response to what has been presented and any additional information that they want to throw into the discussion. I'm going to start off with Darlene, if you might tell us what your thoughts are.
Good morning, Dr. King and all participants. Certainly the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service welcomes this transparency survey, open budget survey. We expected it to indicate where Jamaica was currently or is currently in terms of transparency, participation, oversight. We do, however, have a number of issues with the assessment that has been done. The open budget survey comes with some preconceived positions on what should represent, for instance, the 8 areas that it seeks to look at. And I think those positions have led to the level that we have been identified as at under this survey. So if I could just run back through some of what Dr. King has indicated. I'll start with a pre-budget statement where it is being said that we essentially do not have a published pre-budget statement. By determining that the pre-budget statement must be the budget call, which for Jamaica is not something that's published, then yes, you are then reflecting, suggesting that we do not have a pre-budget statement. But our pre-budget statement is actually the interim fiscal policy paper. It is the mid-year paper, which is legislatively due 6 months after the start of a fiscal year. And it also, the legislation also indicates what is to be included in that document. And among those things, it is what is being planned for the coming fiscal year. So we have been publishing our interim fiscal policy paper every year since its introduction, been in place for quite a number of years. And this is what actually informs our budget call. So the budget call is not published, but the interim fiscal policy paper is published. And therefore, we think that is a major oversight in this assessment to say that we do not have a published pre-budget statement. The interim fiscal policy paper gives a considerable amount of information. It covers not just the coming fiscal year, but the medium term in terms of what the government is planning. And I think that needs to be re-examined. Item 2, executive budget proposal. The estimates of expenditure is tabled annually. It's actually tabled in February, prior to the start of the new fiscal year, which starts in April. We have been, again, for quite a number of years, and this was legislatively adjusted, been tabling the estimates before, along with the fiscal policy paper, before the start of the new fiscal year. In fact, it is a requirement now for the budget for a fiscal year to be passed before we get into that fiscal year. And we have in fact been doing that. There was one exception, and that was when the government changed close to the budget period. Outside of that, Jamaica has met the passing of the budget prior to the new fiscal year. In terms of the actual estimates of expenditure, the estimates of expenditure includes a considerable amount of information, detail. There are the amounts. There is some text on what some of these things are, the functional classifications. The budget includes quite a bit. So just so you're aware, this is what we're talking about as the budget. This is actually the as passed. The one that is tabled is yellow. The as passed is gray. All of these exist and are publicly available. It's up on the website as well. The budget is posted on our website. So again, I think we need to look back at what the government of Jamaica has put out there in this respect. That would cover also the enacted budget, where this gray volume is the budget as passed.
All right, Darlene. So the point, I think, is that the ministry believes that there's actually more information that is available than is reflected in our assessment, which would be a fantastic thing. And since we're going to be repeating this exercise early next year, it would be, we're actually quite pleased to be able to make those adjustments. Because as we said, we think Jamaica has done moderately well, and to know that there's even more information would be a great thing. I'm going to jump to Monique, actually, to respond to some of the things that you have said and to say, to react to it.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. King. And greetings, everybody viewing us live. As regards to the budget circular, that we did in fact look at the interim fiscal policy paper, which, as the FinSec said would be considered to be the pre-budget statement. However, according to IBP standards, that's the International Budget Partnership Standards, the interim fiscal paper report did not meet the requirements, and therefore it could not be used as a pre-budget statement. And this is because it mainly contains information about the fiscal year in which it is published, and not necessarily about the upcoming year. There are no policy discussions about the upcoming year, and even though it has certain macroeconomic forecasts, it is not enough. And so that is why the budget circular was thought to be a better pre-budget statement. And as it regards to the revenue estimates, those documents were included in what was presented by Dr. King. What had happened was that the year under review, which would have been the 2018-2019 fiscal year, the revenue estimates as well as the revenue estimates for Jamaica public bodies, those were not published on time. However, to make this discussion more contemporaneous, we analyzed those documents and put it into perspective, and they have been included in the analysis that Dr. King referred to earlier.
Thank you. Thank you, Monique. At this point, I think it's a good idea for Claire Schouten from IBP to give us her reaction to the presentation and to what has been said so far. Hi, Claire.
Hi.
And thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much for having us. So I think we're having this discussion at a time when many governments are shifting their priorities and realigning tax and spending policies. And while this crisis demands swift and decisive action, it also requires honesty and transparency and engagement like we're having today, and public trust. And just on where the Open Budget Survey is coming from, it's from this rationale that more open budgets can benefit everyone, and countries with more open budgeting systems tend to have greater equity.
We're not hearing.
Better development outcomes. Can you hear me now?
Well, I'm hearing you.
Okay, great. And higher levels of transparency are associated with smaller deficits, with lower borrowing costs, and more credible budgets. And greater participation, as we've been discussing today, in the budget process is linked to more effective service delivery and a greater willingness to pay taxes. And so we have an opportunity together to strengthen social contracts and reconnect across stakeholders, as we're doing today, in ways that promote everyone's well-being, which is a very objective of the Open Budget Survey. And just on the Open Budget Survey, it reflects international standards from the international financial institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD as well, and the principles of the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency and Public Participation. This is an 18-month process, as Monique mentioned, and the data of the Open Budget Survey 2019, which from the 31st up until the 31st of December of 2018. And already we've been hearing about some of the progress since then, which is very exciting. And it's a process also of involving the government in the review process. And we were delighted that the government of Jamaica was involved in reviewing the survey with us. Ultimately, we've seen progress, as we've discussed today, but also in the region and in the world more broadly. We're excited about the fiscal commission, about the investment map, about the opportunities for participation and the investment map that we've been discussing today, but also about strong oversight. We've heard about the real-time audits of the COVID-19 measures in Jamaica and about the strong engagement of civil society in the governance process. Of course, there's much more to do. That's why we launched a call to open budgets. This is a 5-year, 4-goal movement to accelerate progress for an equitable future. And with governments and partners around the world, international and national and local actors, we are guiding public demand and working to publish information in a meaningful way, create opportunities for all to participate in the budget process, strengthen monitoring and oversight of budget execution, and ultimately sustain these practices beyond political shifts. So this will take a collaborative approach that unites across civil society, governments, private sector, and other actors. And it's an urgent agenda, as we've heard today, and we look forward to working together with you on this agenda. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Claire. Jeanette, you've pretty much dedicated your life to keeping governments honest. Well, keeping this government honest. What is your take on this?
Thank you, Damien. It's really wonderful to be here with you guys. I love the subject. You're right. It probably feels like I've been doing it for a lifetime, but not quite. I first heard about the International Budget Partnership. It's a good place to start. Who has supported and funded this survey back in 2014. I don't think Claire probably even knows this. I had to go down into the memory bank. But at the time, I was the co-executive director, just dipping my toes then into advocacy for the Jamaica Civil Society Coalition. And I do recall, Claire, at the time, that Jamaica was not yet even able. IBP was basically doing a scoping of countries to determine whether or not we could even satisfy the parameters to be a part of such a survey. And in 2013, 2014, we were not. So I want to start off by acknowledging what Damien has already indicated and Claire, that we are making progress. And even though the scores might not reflect that, about one parliamentary year later, we were not only able to be scoped and to be a part of the survey, but in some very real ways, as Damien has said, and I believe Ms. Morrison has indicated, since that 2018 survey and 2020, we have already made significant changes in having a citizens budget, which we didn't have at the time, and we couldn't get a score for that. The Independent Fiscal Council in the Parliament on Tuesday, the bill has now been tabled. And we're also looking at the investment map. So Jamaica is moving in the right direction. However, the reason that I do what I do really came out of the opportunity to do research in 2016 with the same coalition in the accountability framework of Jamaica, recognizing that there are serious gaps, especially as it relates to oversight. And then in that very same year, I had the opportunity to lead out in some research to create Jamaica's first citizens budget. So it was a citizen-centric way of not just looking at the budget and explaining it and simplifying it, but creating a guide for citizens so that we could demystify the budget. And I want to share with everyone that I did not anticipate the impact and the residue that left on me. And if I was to ask what I want to be the takeaway for this conversation is to kind of stir a similar interest in everybody listening to become budget literate and to become parliament literate. Because that document, and Ms. Morrison picked it up, Darlene, I have the yellow one, which means I'm a little bit behind. I need to get my hands on the gray. But that 900-page document, which I used to just see when I was in government as a technical working government for the technocrats, when I learned to read one page, all of a sudden the 900 pages didn't seem so intimidating after all, and that's the way to look at it. But what I didn't anticipate is that it would have created such a shift in giving me a sense of belonging and a sense of ownership of Jamaica. So the big takeaway for me this morning is wanting to encourage citizens to understand the seat of accountability, which is the parliament, and this budget cycle, which I used to consider as just the part where the ministries tell the government what they want and the government tries to shave it down, and then we go into parliament and we know that whatever the government says is what's going to happen because they have the majority, and I thought that was the cycle. No, the cycle does involve citizen participation, the execution of that budget, and then the oversight. I just want to say that coming away also from learning how to read the budget and to understand it, it also came across to me less like a technical document and more like a family budget. And I'm not exaggerating. I can't explain it, but suddenly my address in Jamaica was no longer a physical space on a road. It became Jamaica. It was a family budget. My home was now Jamaica. The issues were now more about me than it was just about the technocrats in the ministry. It was a document that was about the promises of government for the year, the priorities and the problems. And so at the end of this discussion this morning, I think what I would like as a takeaway is to really create an interest. And that is the purpose of the Jamaica Accountability Meter Portal. I'll end by saying that what JAMP wants to do, what we've been working on for a year, we've only been a year old, is to strengthen the accountability mechanisms of government, which is to support the work that Ms. Morrison is doing. We also want to educate the public around public financial management issues So that means the parliament. Decisions gets made when? Every Monday in the cabinet, every Tuesday in the parliament, every Friday laws are made for us, and we do not understand that process. And last but by no means least, what JAMP wants to do is to, after we strengthen the accountability mechanisms with your help, educate the public around these issues, we're gonna wanna stimulate you to get engaged, because many of us understand it, but we're not getting in the ring. So that's where I'd like to leave the preliminary comments, that we've come a long way, we're in the process. We need the citizens to understand it better. We need you to engage. And by the time Claire is here sitting down with us another 2 years, it's gonna be an entirely different conversation as a result of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette. You know, one of the questions that has come in is that the person is curious to know how deeply into society these transparency activities actually reach. And that's a critical question to what we're getting at here. And Claire, I wonder, we have these sort of objective measures that we look at. And I know the citizens' budget is also supposed to address this in particular. But Claire, since you're really familiar with the entire process and how we put together these transparency measures, I wonder if you could speak to this, that is this really sufficient to ensure that the fiscal information really gets to everybody? And how can it be done better?
Great, no, thanks so much. And again, it comes to the heart of why we're doing this. And more than 15 years ago, people around the world were struggling for access to information on what their governments were doing. How were they spending their money, as you were highlighting earlier? And that's why we developed the Open Budget Survey. That's why we worked with the norm setters and researchers and activists around the world to undertake this survey, to assess, critically review budget documents, opportunities for participation with all branches of government, and the role and effectiveness of oversight institutions. And now here we are, 2020, 15 years later, in the case of a pandemic, and we're seeing adaptations and innovations in open budget practices, but we're also seeing how important this really is in places around the world. In South Africa, for example, people are doing a survey with our Open Budget Survey colleagues and with our International Budget Partnership team there, and many of the social activists that we work with, conducting social audits in informal settlements, ensuring that people have information on toilets and knowing how they can get better services in their communities. And already we're seeing thousands of households that are benefiting from improved service delivery because they're getting access to that information, sharing that information, and holding government to account. We're seeing examples around the world of people who have been excluded from the budget process who are now part of that budget process. So people with disabilities in Senegal, for example, and other communities that have been marginalized. So again, we want to see the budget process open. We want people to have their voice in the budget process. We want them to be able to know and report what their services are in fact being delivered in their communities, and ultimately working together to enhance accountability and development outcomes. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue into what we have identified as the greatest weakness, which is the channels for people to actually participate.
Right.
And a question that has been put to us on Slido, the platform we are using to take questions from those who are watching, and it asks, and Darlene, I wonder if you can only speculate on this. The question is asking, how can citizens actually become more involved in the budget making process? Now, I'm asking you only for a speculation because, I pointed out that this is the first time that we're doing this objective assessment of the government's fiscal openness. And we were able to identify progress that the government has actually made in this regard prior to now. So I think that evidence is that the government is actually committed on its own, not just to game the score, but committed on its own to the openness process because you've been making progress. So going forward, what do you think are the possible ways that the government can actually create channels for people to have input?
So the current legislative system under which government operates does not provide for the average citizen to have an input at the point of budget debate, as I'm sure you're aware. Something like that would require a legislative amendment to the standing orders. We do, for instance, putting out the citizens' budget, provide sources through which the public can communicate back with us. This is also provided in our putting out of the budget and of the medium-term debt management strategy. While the survey speaks about participatory democracy, that is really not what Jamaica is, although it has moved in some respects to try and further involve the average citizen. But the situation as it currently is that the citizen has elected somebody to represent their interests. So they can also speak through the MPs to put forward anything that they want to put forward. But there are, in fact, existing channels, existing email.
Well, one of the channels that exists is, as we pointed out, when the Accountant General is executing her audit at the end of the process, and one viewer is asking, when these consultations, and perhaps Monique, you can speculate on this, when these consultations with the Accountant General take place, which is the writing in and the focus groups, somebody wants to know how can they become somebody to participate?
May I?
Sure, or Ms. Calder also, she's also experienced.
Okay.
Dr. King, just to point out, it is the Auditor General who is the reference. We have been speaking to the Accountant General, the Auditor General.
Yes, Jeanette, you want to take that?
Yes. Comment on the matter of citizen engagement. It's a crucial question that came before. And though I agree with Ms. Morrison that from a statutory and legislative standpoint, there is not a lot of entry points, my suggestion is that citizens begin where we can. And at this point in time, from a local government standpoint, there are two funds where we can begin to wrap our heads around participation in the public financial management. And that's the Constituency Development Fund. And recently we've been trying to do some investigation into the Equalization Fund. I can tell you that that one is not one many citizens know about. But from the CDF perspective, if we were to do a quick canvas and Slido and ask how many citizens have actually attended a CDF meeting, most citizens would tell you that we didn't know that it is required by the policy for us to attend. What I mean by that is the policy actually indicates that the Parliament's Constituency Development Fund Committee cannot approve any proposal by a member of Parliament unless they have actually met with their constituents to determine how that $20 million is to be used. Now, if citizens don't know that, if they don't understand how the policy works, one, that you are supposed to meet with your MP, that the projects cannot be approved unless the MP can substantiate that they have met with the constituents, then it changes the whole conversation about my role at the local government level. And it also changes the conversation around holding my MP to account for what it is he's going to do with that 20 million. So my suggestion is we start there. The Equalization Fund is another even much bigger fund than the CDF fund. Most citizens talk about transparency. Most citizens have no clue that it exists. But that is 10% of the property taxes. And as most of us know, if we pay property tax, that ballooned a couple of years ago. So has the fund. This is a fund that was created by government, good policy, as the name suggests, to equalize, help out the parishes that don't have enough coming in from property taxes to create, proper roads and markets and fix all of those things. That fund has ballooned. Most of us don't know how to access it. Most of us don't know how much it is. So I am suggesting that where we begin, until we can make those inroads to change the legislation, let us get more acquainted with the CDF fund. Let us get more acquainted with the Equalization Fund. And last, but by no means least, For example, here in Kingston, the municipality has just done a wonderful job of creating a website. Everything you would need to know about the KCAC, administratively, functionally, forms are there, permits, you name it. What is missing? Public financial management information. Nothing about the inflows into the KCAC, nothing about the outflows. Those are the kind of things that I think we need to start having conversations about before we get to the stage of probably having, you know, the national budget impact that we hope to at some point in time.
That is referred to by Jeanette is the City of Kingston municipal government. I would like those watching to click on the poll tab on Slido and to answer the question, do you have a better understanding of budget openness, the budget process and budget openness coming out of this discussion? Now, one of the viewers raises the question, you know, one of the problems with any kind of objective measure is whether it actually does capture the thing that you're trying to measure. And so the question, has the government demonstrated transparency in ways that are not accounted for by the survey? And I dare say that Darlene would have an opinion on that. I don't know if Darlene, you want to jump in for us. I want to get some other views on that as well.
I would say that there are transparencies at a much higher level than has been accounted for by the survey. And just to note a few points, our public accounts, our public administration and appropriation committee actually meets on virtually a weekly basis. Not a few times per year. It meets very frequently. It looks at the ongoing budget, various areas of what they are being implemented. It's discussed with the various permanent secretaries, relevant heads of agencies. There is significant review of that taking place during the year. The fiscal policy paper, the actual annual fiscal policy paper, gives you a review of the previous year and virtually lays out everything. There is a lot that is not captured under this survey. I think Jamaica's debt. We have a medium-term debt management strategy, which includes all of the information. It's published along with the budget. I see some of the referencing in here that doesn't seem to have recognized that. All of the debt information is in that document. FPP only does a short summary of it, but there's a whole document on the debt. It's not captured. So no, I do not think that the transparency level has been appropriately reflected in the survey.
I'd like to comment on that today, man, when I can.
All right, let me ask Monique to comment on it first. And you know, I have to tell you something that, Darlene, what you have just said just now, we actually hope that that is exactly right. In other words, we would welcome if there's greater transparency than what we have even seen already. But I don't know, Monique, if you can add to that. In terms of the extent to which we have actually not captured the information that Darlene is pointing. So you're in defense now.
So what I can say is that the year under review, at that point in time, when we contacted the members of or someone who would have acknowledged about the PAAC and their meetings, it was relayed to us that they have not met more than 3 times for the year that was under review. And I'm certain of that because I trust the contacts. So it is good that they are now meeting virtually because that is a good indicator that the government wants to be more open in the process.
Jeanette, you.
Oh yes, thanks. I wanted to speak just really quickly about this thing called an accountability loop, because as we all know, a chain is really as strong as its weakest link. and I've said it many times, Jamaica has an exceptionally, in my opinion, robust accountability framework in terms of the legislation and the institutions. One of these days, I would love to share how we stack up against other Caribbean countries. Having said that, however, the weak link, whereas it might be true that there are some things the survey didn't capture in terms of transparency, which is positive, it's also equally true to say that there are some things that the survey didn't capture. That is also very disappointing, troubling about the accountability framework, particularly as it relates to the Public Accounts Committee and as it relates to the Public Appropriation and Administrations Committee. And it's not just about the attendance, which has improved tremendously since the 2018 survey. And Monique is correct in saying that year it was as bad as that, but it has improved significantly, as most of the members of the public here know. But where we have an exceptionally weak link is that the Parliament of Jamaica creates these subcommittees. They are the chief oversight committees. They look at some of the most egregious breaches and occasions of waste and mismanagement. We're talking about billions of dollars. Faithfully every year, the PAC and the PAAC will create a report. Why? Because they're just a subcommittee of government, of the Parliament. The subcommittee that was created by the Parliament has to go back to the Parliament, to the full suite, to report back what are their recommendations for the year. Very small, non-intimidating report done, usually no more than about 12 pages. We have gone back 15 years in our research. These reports are faithfully tabled, but they have never been placed on the agenda of the House for discussion and debate and for decisions to be taken holistically and comprehensively to ensure that there is no recurrence. And I'm talking 15 years. Maybe if I go back another 20, that is a significant gap in the accountability framework. And when we talk about transparency, in the last 5 years, what we have found is that though these reports would be faithfully tabled, the PAC and the PAAC, for the last 5 years, none have been tabled. So what that means for transparency is that even though they were not being debated, it means that the media can no longer access these reports. It means that civil society can't. And that for me is really a nosedive in terms of transparency. So it is true to say that there's some things that the report is not capturing. That is positive. But there's also some very telling signs about a regression that the report is also not capturing.
Great. I'm going to take those as your wrap-up thoughts. We have another openness exercise that we're going to conduct next year. So, Monique, in your final minute, I would like you to tell me, what you would need to happen so that our survey next year, could be more effective and could be more useful.
Okay, so the ministry has been cooperative so far, and we would like for that to continue, especially as it regards to accessing the information. We're looking forward to that, and we've had promises, so we're holding you to your word. And yes, I think that's basically it, because that is the brunt of what this survey captures. It is really us trying to cooperate with the Ministry of Finance to find out what exactly happens in the budget process.
Thank you. Darlene, your final thoughts in a minute.
All right, so in moving forward, I think we need to, the survey needs to take into account anything that is peculiar to the country. So again, I still need to raise the interim fiscal policy paper. I don't know if the particular one that was looked at didn't give enough information going forward, but that is what the interim fiscal policy paper does. So certainly others should be reflecting the coming year and medium term. Or budget call is not going to give you the kind of information that you seem to be looking for. The budget call is something that goes to our ministries and gives them really some figures around which they create their budgets. The call itself is not going to give you the information you're looking for. It's in the FPP. So I would say that's just an example that where we have other things that are specific to Jamaica that they need to be taken account of, as opposed to something that was set, that this is where you should see such and such. So our medium-term debt management strategy, again, as I say, is something that's published annually, has been since about 2090s, since I'm being told the 90s here. It's there. It has all the debt information. So I would say maybe some closer working with the Ministry of Finance to ensure that we are in fact looking at everything that exists, because, and certainly upon our website, we have a significant amount of information.
Okay, thank you. Monique, quickly.
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Morrison, I welcome that discussion, especially as regards to the pre-budget statement, because we do want to reflect accurate information, right? That is your job here at CAPRI. And as far as it goes, we want to do that. So I welcome the discussion to, especially as regards to the pre-budget statement, so that we can both agree on what is appropriate.
That's exactly right. Darlene, in terms of they need to take into account, but it's actually us. It's between you and ourselves, and we are going to take it into account because we want this to be an even more accurate reflection of what Jamaica does, which we concluded is a fairly good effort. And clearly the sentiment of the Ministry of Finance is to make more information available. So it's looking good for our next exercise. Our survey reveals that all of the viewers, the participants, thought that this exercise improved their understanding of fiscal openness and the budget process. So we're quite pleased about that. And I want to turn the attention to the closing remarks as we wrap up our discussion on fiscal openness. Natasha.
From the discussion, we can see that Jamaica has made progress in the areas of transparency and oversight in the budget process. We also see that there are limited channels for public participation, and as such, there is a lot of opportunity for the government to improve in this area and overall to improve in all of the areas: transparency, oversight, and public participation. The full report can be downloaded from our website, capricaribbean.org/reports. On behalf of CAPRI, I extend a hearty thank you to the IBP, our panelists, and all of our corporate sponsors. We can also view the results from the poll here. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
Sir, what kind of